Hi, welcome back to Projects with Everyday Dave. It is such a relief to finally be to the milestone of putting some trim work in this house. I remember when I was on the scaffolding stacking foam for these ICF walls. These are ICF concrete poured walls, and there were times I didn't think I would ever make it to this point. So to finally be finished with some of this interior trim work is such a relief for me. Today I'm going to show you the process I went through to build these very deep, 9-inch deep jamb extensions for these windows. These windows are 9 feet tall, so it was a big process to get them all to align nicely. And also for making the trim, the special header work for the windows and installing that. I'll even throw in a bonus reveal of the master bathtub and its window, which turned out pretty well. So let's dig into it. Because these are ICF walls, I needed to make jamb extensions that were 9 inches deep. And I have more than 30 windows in this building. These windows are 9 feet tall. I have hundreds of board feet of wood just in these jamb extensions. So I went to my local sawmill and I picked up some rough sawn lumber, as much as possible boards that were more than 9 inches wide, so I wouldn't have to do any more glue up than necessary. Then I ran them through the planer, flattened them out. I used my track saw to put a straight edge on one side and then the table saw to parallel that out. When I didn't have enough boards that were wide enough, I made a special fixture for my router to make some homemade biscuits, and I joined those up with a bunch of clamps and glue to make boards wide enough, and then I went ahead and ran those through the planer and sanded them down. Once I had my boards all sanded and planed, I took them in to the paint booth that I set up in my basement for all this trim work. I did the painting for them. I sprayed primer on them, and then I sanded each board by hand to get to smooth out the primer, and then I painted them all. Once the boards were ready for paint, I painted them with a Sherwin-Williams Snap Dry through my Graco airless paint gun, and that worked pretty efficiently to get everything covered with one coat. For the doors and regular windows, I made a 5-inch tall header, and for the tall windows, I made it 6.5 inches tall to give it a little bit more style. To build the headers, I simply took the stock that I had milled to size and cut it to length on the radial arm saw. I then used my drum sander to sand the pieces, starting with 100 grit and going all the way up to 150 grit, so that it would be ready to paint as soon as I was done assembling. I used a right angle square to make a simple jig on my table saw to hold all the pieces in place while I assembled them. I used a 1/2 inch spacer and set it in the groove of the table saw and slid the center board against it and allowed the side boards to slip past it against the square, and that set a perfect gap on both ends for me on every part without having to measure. I then used some Titebond 3 adhesive to glue the boards together, just putting on a thin layer and sliding the boards together to make sure that there was good contact, then setting it tightly in the fixture and using 18 gauge brads to secure it in place while it's set. I made sure the parts were held down tight to the table saw so that they would be flat and square for when I assembled them to the building. I applied the same steps to the back piece, just a little bit of adhesive, and secured it with brads. That completes each piece, and I applied the same process for all the rest of the headers. In order to smooth the edges, I just used a block plane to take a little bit of a chamfer and some sandpaper to round it off. That way the paint applies smoothly around the entire part. I used a nail set to set any nails that were sticking out, and then I used just some simple wood putty to fill those holes and sand them smooth to make them invisible after it's painted. I use some extreme stretch caulk from DAP to fill the groove between the top and bottom pieces. This makes sure that when I paint it, there's no gap that's visible. Once all of those pieces were assembled and sanded, I took them to the paint booth and primed them and got them prepared for another sand and paint. I painted them all in a series for efficiency. After the parts were painted, I used the sled on my table saw to cut the smaller trim pieces to exactly the right length so that they would fit perfectly in the opening. For the sills, I used a small jig to measure the gap between the window and the sill at the back. Then I transferred that measurement up to the front. I made all of the offsets a little bit wide so that I'd be able to make them match exactly for each window. Then I just used a piece of masking tape to follow the line so it would be really easy when I put it on the table saw to line it up and not get any chip out. I used a guide against my saw fence when I cut the show side so that it wouldn't mar the surface that's already painted. Then I just flipped it around and made an adjustment to the saw position to cut the other side. After that, I just used a handsaw to cut off the remaining pieces, and then it was a perfect fit to the wall. I dry fit the jamb extensions, and here you can see there's a little bit of a gap, and that only happened in one place. One of the windows was slightly out of position, so I just used my track saw and matched it up at the bottom where it was touching and about a 1/8 inch gap at the top. After I made that offset, I just used the track saw to trim it and get that to align more perfectly with the opening. I had to make a very slight adjustment at the top as well. I just used a block plane to make that adjustment, and after that it fit perfectly against the window. Once I had made all of those minor adjustments to the individual pieces, I was able to assemble them. I just made a clear spot on the floor, which had to be fairly large since the windows were so tall. I just used a small drill bit to tap the holes so I didn't split out the wood, and I used a square to make sure things were basically aligned. And once I had that, I shot Torx screws into the sill and into each connecting trim board. With these really tall windows, since they're actually two separate windows, I have to make a jump over the framed in portion in the middle, which added a bit of complication and actually a lot more trim work. But I didn't really have another good way to have an opening window at the bottom and a fixed window at the top. So I just made these small extensions to jump over it, and still gives me the overall look of one large window because the jamb extensions are continuous. Even though I ran everything through the planer and the sander, there was some slight twist to the boards, and I just used a bar clamp to kind of pull things together when I was setting those screws so that it wouldn't twist on me. And then I had a stack of paper I slid under it to get the bottom surface perfectly flush since the floor isn't perfectly flat, and that worked out pretty well. At the top, it doesn't go all the way to the edge because I'm making space for my recessed blinds, and I'll do another video on that to show you how I did the recessed blinds, but that little tab sticking up is where they mount. Once I had all of the boards screwed together and basically square, I could set it in the opening and make sure that it was fitting properly before getting everything plumb and level with some shims. Once I shimmed up the bottom and everything was set properly, I could squirt some adhesive underneath to fill in the gap and make sure that it would be solid once it was complete. Okay, I put a shim in here to get this set right where we want it. I'm using these trim head finish screws. I like to pre-drill a hole just helps it come out smoother. set the vertical trim pieces, I just used an adjustable square to set the offset to exactly what I wanted it to be. Once I had that position set, then I could just shoot 18 gauge brad nails into the trim to hold it in place before I used screws to secure it firmly to the wall. To install the lower piece of trim, I need to find my studs, and in my case I have a stud every 8 inches. And I can look under here and see where it is. Just put a little mark on the wall there. Then I'll put a piece of tape and mark it there. So I know where to put my screws. Then when I place my board up underneath, I have a little spacer that I use to set the flushness. There we go. And I can just clamp it in place. Drill a hole. Choose one of these trim screws. Now to do the vertical pieces, the left side doesn't line up with the studs, so I'm going to use these 5-inch long trim head screws, which leave a pretty small hole, but they're long enough to get all the way through the foam and into the frame around the window. To fill the holes, I just use some Elmer's white wood filler. Alright, when that dries, it's hardly noticeable.